I'm Jen Taylor Skinner, and this is The Electorette. On this episode, I talk with Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers about her new book, They Were Her Property.
Isn't that nice?
In her new book, They Were Her Property, Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers examines the role of white women in the antebellum South, and she unmasks the truth, one that's completely counter to the narrative that's been painted by past historians, one that usually minimizes the role of white women in the institution of slavery, and it paints them as reluctant bystanders, or even as allies to enslaved people. But that was far from the truth, as Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers reveals in this new book. This was a really emotional book to read because it forces you to revisit the brutality of slavery through yet another painful lens. But I have to emphasize this. It's an important piece of history that we should not look away from because there are so many parallels to today's political landscape. Think about it. Whose lives are we willing to discard for the comfort and gain of others? Whose labor goes unseen or is exploited so that we can all have more? So here is my conversation with Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers. Your book, first of all, it was a really emotional read for me. And so you not only dispel the myth that white women were bystanders in the brutality of slavery, which is a common narrative.
Yes.
But in the book, you disprove that, and you show that, not only were they complicit, but in many ways, they were pretty adept at slave ownership and everything that comes along with that. Yes. Including participating in the capitalistic aspects of it.
Yes.
Right? The thing that I find really interesting is that all of these narratives that were taught in school or, in books, up until this point, they try to paint this facade of America, especially during the slavery years, where white women are painted as, not complicit. And what I find really interesting about that is that often that narrative is so consistent, right? That not only do we not know what the real truth is, but often we don't know that there is another truth to look for, right? And so that's what I found. Like, how did you know that there was another truth about this? What was your first clue?
So when I was in graduate school, I began this project as my dissertation in 2009. And I was also completing coursework. And so I was reading a lot of materials, prepping for the exams that we have to take in order to move forward with the dissertation. And I noticed that the scholarship about white Southern women, particularly the history of the South, the history of white motherhood, and the history of white women's relationships to the institution of slavery, seemed to be quite distinct and quite remarkably different than those narratives that were being constructed and developed and told in the histories of the African American experience in the United States. So those scholars who focused on African American history seemed to be telling a very different story and using different sources to tell that story than the scholars who were documenting the experiences of white Southern women in the slave South. And so I was really kind of frustrated by what seemed to me to be a disconnect between these two subfields of history, those historians who looked at Southern women's lives in the South in the 19th century and those who looked at the lives of formerly enslaved people, because it seemed to me that they were, really talking maybe not even at each other, but there were these two kind of parallel narratives about white women's relationships to slavery that didn't seem to intersect. And for me, the intersection was, or the lack of intersection was primarily the economic dimension of the institution. And so for me, I wondered, what is it about these two narratives? Why is there this disconnect? And so looking at the sources that those narratives were constructed upon, and that they drew upon, that to me led to the answer, which was that scholars of Southern women were looking at the places which we would assume they would look, at the narratives that emerged in white women's letters to each other and to others, their diaries. So those documents that a very small group of white women left behind, typically very literate and elite white women left behind to tell this story about their relationships to the institution of slavery. And so looking at what African American historians were using, those sources that they were using, I noticed that they were using the narratives of formerly enslaved people, the testimonies of formerly enslaved people to tell the story that included very deeply white women in the story of the economy of American slavery, the kind of economic dimensions of the story. So that led me to, the question, if I look at these narratives, these testimonies of formerly enslaved people, what will they tell me about white women's economic relationships to the institution of slavery? And so when I looked at those narratives, when I looked at those testimonies, I found that formerly enslaved people had a lot to say about white women's economic investments in the institution of slavery. And so I used those narratives, those testimonies, to guide the direction that I took as I crafted this narrative about white women's economic investments in the institution. And they led me elsewhere to other sources, which I'd, be happy to talk about as well.
Yeah. So what were some of those sources? You said testimony, were they journals or interviews or what form?
So what's really fascinating is that during the 1930s, right after the Great Depression, the federal government sought to reemploy as many unemployed people as they possibly could. And so they developed a number of different agencies. One in particular was called the Federal Writers Project. And so through the Federal Writers Project, the federal government sought out as many formerly enslaved people as they possibly could and wanted to have formerly unemployed writers to interview those formerly enslaved people and to try to document their experiences in slavery. And so they found about close to 3,000 formerly enslaved people. And so we have access to the interviews that those writers, those government federal writers conducted with formerly enslaved people. And so looking at those interviews, I essentially just combed through those interviews to try to determine, one, whether formerly enslaved people mentioned their mistresses in those interviews. Two, what did they have to say about their mistresses? Did they identify their mistresses as their owners? Or did they identify other white women in those interviews as possible owners or possibly invested in the economy of American slavery? And then if they did, in fact, identify white women as owners in those interviews, what did they have to say about that relationship, that ownership, their ownership? Did they talk about white women who bought and sold them or who inherited them, et cetera? So by using those sources, by using those interviews, I was able to document the myriad ways that formerly enslaved people talked about how white Southern women were economically invested in their continued subjugation. And then I used those testimonies, used those interviews to seek out corroborating evidence in other sources. So for example, there are bills of sale that documented every transaction involving an enslaved person being bought or sold. So I looked at those sales, I looked at those bills of sale, which are very much like receipts that we receive today when we purchase something, to see if those documents identified a female buyer or seller. There were thousands and thousands of women in those bills of sale. I looked at legal records, court records, to see if women sued other people or if people sued them over any issue related to ownership of an enslaved person or contested ownership over an enslaved person. And then I also looked at the account books of slave traders. So these were men, typically men who bought and sold enslaved people for a living. I tried to see if I could find white women as buyers or sellers in those account books. I found women in those account books. And then once I got to the Civil War era, I tried to find out if white women were discussed in military correspondence. And I found, Union officials, Confederate officers and Union officers talking about white women who had some issue related to an enslaved person that they claimed to own. So I was finding all of these white women, white slave-owning women in particular, in these other sources, primarily because of what formerly enslaved people had to say about white slave-owning women and the relationships that they saw emerge over the course of their lifetimes with regard to the economy of American slavery.
Wow. Your book sent me on kind of a personal search, and I started thinking about the women in my own family and the generations before me and trying to, do the math to see where and when the lineage to slavery might have begun, and I'm thinking about, possibly my great grandmother or just one generation prior to that, could have possibly been a slave. But, my point is that, we're not really that far removed from these legacies.
Absolutely. And I think what's really fascinating is that we see slavery and the kind of vestiges of slavery, the afterlife of slavery, as something so far removed, so very distant from the present. And it's not really the case. That's not really the case. My grandparents were sharecroppers in North Carolina. I was on Twitter last week, and someone was talking about, how their mom had an outhouse in like the 1970s. And I was like, my great aunt had an outhouse in 2001. So this idea that, slavery and kind of the aftermath of slavery are so distant from us that we're untouched in many respects by the legacy of slavery is I think, a false one that many of us still kind of hold. But when we look, even just not even really hard, if just look a little bit more deeply than we usually do for these kind of vestiges of slavery and the oppressive systems that emerged right after slavery was over, we can see them everywhere. They are all around us.
Yeah. The opening of the book, just really kind of took my heart out of my chest because you talk about children, right? And the children of slave owners, and how they were groomed to be brutal, right? And to make sure that they understood the hierarchy between themselves as free people and the enslaved people, right?
Absolutely.
And I thought it was really remarkable because you'd have these children who may have an enslaved child as a playmate, right? And that child might sleep on the floor beside them, and then they would, be their servant the next day or their slave the next day, right? And this conflation between the role of, enslaved person and companion, right? How did they accomplish making sure that these children understood their relationship and would be adequately brutal?
So going to what formerly enslaved people had to say, that their testimonies, the interviews that the federal government conducted with them in the 1930s actually led me to that realization that, when we think about white women's relationship to slavery, we often begin our kind of our process of questioning and interrogation when they're adults. But what formerly enslaved people were saying quite often is that little girls, when white women were not even women, when they were girls, sometimes even infants, they were receiving enslaved people as gifts, whether it be birthday gifts, Christmas gifts, and also, and most especially, as wedding gifts. So during the wedding receptions, for example, slave-owning parents would give enslaved people to their daughters as their wedding gifts. And there'd be kind of this ceremony at the reception after the wedding took place, where they would give young white women, enslaved people as their own. So there were all these moments over the course of white women's lives where they received enslaved people, or they were told that they would receive enslaved people. And so as a part of that, they also learned lessons about how to manage enslaved people effectively. They were allowed to practice disciplinary techniques. There were also parents who not only gave their daughters vicarious lessons in slave mastery and slave discipline, but also allowed for them to participate in acts of discipline. There's an account in the book where I talk about a white father, who was whipping an older enslaved woman who had, in his eyes, wronged his daughter or had slighted his young white daughter. And so he allowed for his daughter to participate in his disciplining of that older enslaved woman. So there were a variety of ways in which young white girls learned how to be slave owners and also effective slave masters or slave mistresses, where they were able to, or at least taught how to hopefully and eventually create circumstances in which enslaved people would be obedient, in circumstances in which they hoped that enslaved people would submit to their will without resistance. And we know that that was easier said than done because enslaved people rather consistently resisted enslavement and bondage in a variety of ways. But they were taught all of these techniques over the course of their lives so that once they became adults and, in fact, were able to assume full ownership over enslaved people, they had all the tools and the strategies that they needed in order to do that, and hopefully to do that effectively.
Yeah. The thing that people often miss when talking about this is that economic factor, right? Like, think about this as, purely emotional, right? But children had to be groomed so that they could grow up and adequately take care of the family property. I mean, that was one motivation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. And then also, it went both ways, right? I mean, I think you recount stories where enslaved people would be forced to greet babies and infants as mistress or master. So that was part of it as well.
Absolutely. There was a dual process of socialization. And I think it's important to underscore that this was a process by which both white Southerners and enslaved African American Southerners learned about this system. This was not a natural, inherent system. It was one that had to be taught, it had to be learned. And if either side kind of diverged from the paths that were set out for them, there were consequences to that. And so I talk about how not only were young white girls socialized and trained to be slave owners, but the other necessary component of that was for enslaved people to also learn that no matter the age of the white person, no matter the gender of the white person, those individuals were superior in the context of Southern slavery, and that they were to submit to the will of those individuals, no matter who they were, as long as they were white. And so that process unfolded in a variety of ways. And you just mentioned one in which as soon as a white parent gave birth to a child, they would summon all of the enslaved people to the home. And then each and every one of those enslaved people would have to line up, go into the room, greet the newborn as either their young mistress or their young master. And so this was a process by which they then, in that moment, were told, it doesn't matter if this is a newborn, it doesn't matter if this newborn can't even talk or walk yet, you are to respect them as your superior. And so there was this dual process of socialization that was absolutely fundamental to, this racially divided social order that didn't just emerge in slavery, but, that was propagated and promulgated through the institution of slavery, but really began with colonial settlement, to be honest.
Yeah. And the thing is that if they failed to do that, right, there could be really grave consequences if they failed to use, mistress or master with an infant.
Absolutely. One example that I talk about in the book is when a young girl, she wasn't a toddler, but she maybe was about 7 or so, and she did not refer to her mistress's child as master, and so her mistress sent her on an errand, gave her a little note to take to the clerk at a local store, and she brought back a little package. And when she got back with the package, she learned what was inside. It was a whip, and her mistress then began to whip her. And when she asked why she whipped her, she found out she was whipping her because she had not addressed her young son as master. She had not addressed her mistress's young son, who was a toddler, as master. So these are the kinds of repercussions, the kind of costs that enslaved people, even enslaved children paid if they did not embrace that or to learn the lessons that were required of them, the lessons about slave mastery and also white supremacy.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
So at this point in the conversation, I had to take a break and stop recording. The story of this child was really upsetting to me. And of course, we all know about the brutality of slavery, and we know intellectually that children were also brutalized as well. I was reminded of my own child, who is the same age as the child in the story. So while I was pulling myself together during this interview, Stephanie described how tough it was for her to get through her research for the book and how she was able to cope.
I think I'll take this moment to talk about what that process was like for me, because I am a descendant of enslaved people. I'm a descendant of African Americans who lived in a racially hostile world. My mother, was born the year of Brown versus the Board of Education. And so, this is a history that is my own. And so as I read many of these interviews, the level of detail the kind of the level of violence and brutality that the formerly enslaved people described was such that so traumatizing for me at times that I had to take days off from working on this project because I couldn't withstand the trauma that came with reading about these experiences, the atrocities that were committed against these enslaved children and men and women. So it wasn't a very easy process for me either. And it would bother me if it wasn't something that was also quite emotional for my readers as well. It's necessary, because these are the stories that formerly enslaved people told. And they didn't tell them simply because they wanted them hidden in the Library of Congress. They told them because they thought it was important for us as Americans to know and to reckon with. And I think, part of what I hope for by writing this book is that we can reckon with the darkest dimensions of our history and recognize that it is very much a part of our narrative as Americans.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Because I've been talking about the book nonstop since I started reading it. And, the children piece was really hard for me. And there's one story in it, speaking of, vicarious brutality, where, there's a 12-year-old enslaved child who was beaten to death, right?
Yes, absolutely.
While the wife and daughters watched, right?
Yeah.
And I just wonder, and maybe this isn't even a question, like what kind of culture could exist where, people are kind of on the veranda having tea while a child is being beaten to death.
At the core of slavery in the United States or wherever it exists is violence, is a culture of violence. Violence is absolutely necessary for slavery to exist. There's this idea that, enslaved people, they relinquished, they can resign themselves to their status as enslaved people in the United States. And I'll just refer specifically to the context of the book. But what you see on the ground is that in a variety of ways that we don't even recognize as resistance, with air quotes around it, enslaved people were resisting on a daily basis what bondage entailed for them. And even in circumstances where slave owners said, I was very kind to, this person who was my slave, enslaved people saw bondage in itself, whether there was violence or not, as violence, whether there was physical brutality or not, as violence. And so when you think about that, you have to understand that there's a constant resistance that slave owners are constantly having to fight against. So there's always this underlying the system of slavery is violence, is necessary violence in order for that system to continue, for it to be perpetuated. And not only were white slave-owning women or white soon-to-be slave-owning girls socialized into discipline, but they understood that violence was fundamental to the perpetuation of the institution, one that they would benefit from in a variety of ways. And in the book, I showed the economic ways in which they benefited from the perpetuation of the institution. They understood that from a very young age, they understood that violence was absolutely necessary in order to keep the system going, to perpetuate this system. They made a choice, and that choice was white supremacy. And in this particular case, to keep enslaved people in bondage. So, when I describe that case, it's the case of Green Martin and his 3 daughters who witnessed him over the course of several hours, him and his son over the course of several hours, beat a 12-year-old boy to death. When they testified in court, they talked about how this was not uncommon behavior. So we have to remember that these young girls grew up seeing this on a daily basis, hearing the sounds of violence and brutality, hearing the screams and the moans and groans of enslaved people wounded and being beaten. So when you are accustomed to that, when you grow up with that from infancy, it's every day. It's your everyday. It's not exceptional.
Yeah. The thing that, and I alluded to this earlier about the fact that this is often talked about from, an emotional perspective, from, racism. But, there were really, really strong political and economic drivers, like you just mentioned, right? And it's especially important for the women because, the patriarchy had an even bigger stranglehold on the women in that culture. And so this is in a lot of ways all they had, because often when a woman would get married, she would, instead of being given land, she would be given slaves. And in order order to, have any kind of freedom, she would really have to hold on to that property.
Absolutely. And that's one of the fundamental kind of, I think, interventions of the book. Many of the studies of slavery that have come before this book have not examined married women's slave ownership. And the reason why is because there's this assumption that married women wouldn't even be able to own enslaved people, in large part because of this legal doctrine called coverture or couverture in French. And so essentially, you've just described it. When a woman who owned any property or earned any wages would marry, all of that wealth would become her husband's immediately upon marriage. So her identity, her legal identity, as well as her economic identity were subsumed into her husband's, and they became one, a marital unity, as they called it. And so many historians have looked at this legal doctrine of coverture, have looked at the impact that it's had on, many women in the country in the moments in which I'm talking about in this book, and have kind of written off this idea that a number of women could, in fact, find ways to circumvent the constraints of coverture and could, in fact, hold on to property and acquire additional property after marriage. But what I did was I looked at the legal records, again, taking my lead from what formerly enslaved people had to say. And they often talked about married mistresses, married slave-owning women who own them. And so taking my lead from them, I looked at court records and found married women suing their husbands, taking their husbands to court. And in those court records, they would talk about how their husband, sold a slave that they owned and they didn't give him permission. And even deeper into those court records, they described the ways that they circumvented the legal doctrine of coverture, typically using what were called marital contracts back then, but what we would refer to as prenuptial agreements now. They would often have trust estates. So just like we hear about trust fund babies, they would be trust fund babies. They would work with their parents to create these separate trust estates so that their husbands couldn't touch the property that they put in those trusts. So there were all of these ways that they circumvented the law, which, as you mentioned, the law that would grant the patriarch, the white male household head, complete power in terms of economic power over his dependents, and in this case, his wife. They were able to circumvent those laws by using these legal instruments like prenups and trusts to protect and preserve their control over enslaved property in this particular case. And so by looking at those legal documents, I was able to show how women not only maintained possession, but also acquired even more property during the course of their marriages. So it's really an extraordinary thing to find. I didn't expect to find it, of course. Basically, if you read many history books, they tell you that, you wouldn't find married women in courts because of coverture. You certainly wouldn't find them suing their husbands over property that they claim to own. So it's really extraordinary to find these details in these records.
Right. I wonder if that led to even more brutality with white women because it really was their only link there, to any kind of freedom.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And so that's one of the arguments that I make in the book that, for many of these women, and this is to go back to the point you just made, that for many of these women, slavery was their freedom. Because as you said, there are other scholars other historians who look at the women in the colonial period, and they've found that slave-owning parents would typically give their daughters enslaved people and cash versus land. So they would give their daughters the slaves and their daughters money or even sometimes stock, and they would give their sons the land. And so for them, when you kind of reckon with the fact that they cannot vote, that typically they cannot enter the courts, they cannot own a business or have a business in their own name. There are all of these ways in which the law constrains all of the kind of rights that we now enjoy, women enjoy in the United States when they are adults. But women in the South, those who were able to benefit from slave ownership, recognized that by being a slave owner, they actually were able to exercise some of the rights associated with property ownership. They were able to go into the courts. If they could maintain separate personal control over enslaved people as property, they could go into the courts and they could sue other people. They could actually own businesses, again, if they use certain legal instruments to secure businesses. So through slavery, through slave ownership, white women who in most other realms of their lives, dimensions of their lives, had very little, if any, rights, could have a certain kind of body of rights and exercise a certain number of rights with regard to slave ownership that they weren't able to exercise in other dimensions of their lives. So for them, slavery was their freedom, was their way to kind of mitigate some of the constraints imposed upon them by a patriarchal Southern society and also by the courts and the law more broadly.
Yeah, another interesting layer was the conflict within marriages, right? Between slave owners.
Mm-hmm.
So, you'd have these couples who often, couldn't agree on how they treat their slaves. Sometimes men in a marriage would be the more brutal ones. And, sometimes it was reversed. Sometimes the women were more brutal than the men. And couples would actually split over this. And the thing is, it wasn't necessarily about kindness or humanity. I mean, sometimes it was, but, often it was not, right? It was often about what's the best way to preserve our property and our wealth. So how did these conflicts play out in those households? How were these conflicts resolved?
So that was another really fascinating discovery that I stumbled upon when I was reading the interviews that were conducted with formerly enslaved people. We think about the white Southern household and just broadly, white households in this period as very much patriarchal, that the husband was the male head of household and he possessed the power and he may in fact allocate or delegate certain elements of household control and management to his wife, but generally he maintained the power over all dependents in his household, and he had the last say. In the context of some of the households that formerly enslaved people lived in and were raised in and grew up in, they talk about very differently ordered and structured households, wherein when slave-owning couples, both the husband and the wife, owned slaves in their own right, they held legal title to slaves separately, that the kind of order and the kind of way that power was allocated in those households looked very different. It looked like what anthropologist Carol Crumley called a hierarchically ordered household. So hierarchy means there's this one person or one entity in the household that possesses all of the power and control. But in a hierarchical household, there are a variety of ways in which power can be shared. So formerly enslaved people talked about households in which both husbands and wives exercised power, where they shared power. And sometimes the way that they shared that power was configured differently depending on the proclivities and the preferences of the couple in question. There were households in which slave-owning couples would discipline enslaved people in the household, and they would hire an overseer, a manager of the enslaved people who worked in the fields, and that person would discipline the enslaved people who worked in the fields. There were other couples who chose to divide up discipline by gender. So the wife would discipline all the enslaved females, the husband would discipline all the enslaved men. And still then, there were others who, when they owned enslaved people in their own right, would say, I will discipline the slaves that I own, and you discipline the slaves that you own, and you are not to touch mine, and vice versa. And what was really astonishing to me was that there were some formerly enslaved people who described instances in which slave-owning couples had preferences for their own slaves. So there were slave-owning women who would marry, and when they married, they received enslaved people as wedding gifts. They would bring those enslaved people with them to their new homes with their husbands. And so their husbands had already kind of, they would have the husband slaves might be the cook or might be the person who cleaned the parlor. And these white women would come in and replace their husband slaves with their preferred slaves, the slaves that they brought from their own households. So there were all of these really interesting and complex ways that slave-owning couples, particularly when they owned slaves in their own right separately, would configure the power and control in their households. And there were times in which they conflicted. So there were times when slave-owning couples, husbands and wives, they embraced different strategies and disciplinary techniques for managing the enslaved people they owned. And those managerial techniques and strategies were in conflict with each other. And so they would fight with each other over how to discipline the slaves in their households and beyond their households. So it's really interesting when we pay really close attention to what formerly enslaved people have to say about not just white slave-owning women's kind of role in their continued captivity, but also about slavery slavery in general and women's roles in slavery in general, you see a kind of very differently constructed narrative, a different perspective, a very unique and kind of think striking and provocative perspective of what happens behind the curtains of these households.
Yeah. I want to talk about those relationships between white women and the enslaved women, because what's different about them is that they were often really intimate. Right? They would help them bathe, or they would, be wet nurses, or they would, brush their hair or rub their feet. How did that work? I mean, just that level of intimacy.
This, I think, is one of those elements or dimensions of slavery that we'll never truly wrap our heads around, we'll never truly fully grapple with and reckon with, because it gets to the level of psychological. It's quite psychological, and it gets to the level of the subconscious. It's in our human nature to claim to own an individual who has cared for us since we were children, who have cared for us. We've suckled at their breasts. Like how does a person who has nursed at someone's breast over the course of their lives come to then identify that person as a human, but also as property? I think that's something that we still have yet to reckon with. And even psychologists, I don't think, have come up with a good theory as to how that happens. So it's, I think, one of those unknowns that we'll never really truly be able to fully understand.
Yeah. I mean, even when I think about it, and I think about the conversation we started with about, we aren't really that far removed generationally from that, So, at some point, I hope it gets explored, because I'm assuming that we're still living with the remnants of that.
Yeah. I mean, I think when I have a chapter in the book where I talk about how white mothers, for a variety of reasons, they choose to compel enslaved women, enslaved mothers to serve as wet nurses for their infants. And sometimes when they make those decisions, they know very well that they are going to be separating enslaved women from their children, from their newborns even. And yet they still decide to move forward with those decisions. And as over the past year, as we've seen, the crisis at the border, particularly with child separation policies, intentional policies at the administrative level, wherein these are seen as policies that are constructed to separate immigrant children from their mothers, is seen as a deterrent against immigration or undocumented immigration. I think about some of the instances in which interviews have been conducted with people who live on the border. There was one that was quite poignant to me, because there was a white woman who was asked, what if these were your children? How would you feel, if these were your children? And she said they wouldn't be my children. And there's this way in which, I guess, psychologically, we're able to construct ourselves as quite distinct and different from others. And that allows for us to dehumanize them in ways that makes these kinds of atrocities possible. And I think you see this in slavery, but you also see this in the present day. Looking back and reflecting upon these historical moments are instructive in telling us what we're capable of. And how ugly we can truly be if we allow for, these kinds of behaviors and activities to continue.
Yeah, well, the thing is that they really had to push the biological factor that allowed them to have wet nurses. They had to push those parallels back in their minds, right? Because there is a timing factor here. Mm-hmm. That, how did that happen? How did they get the pregnancies to align?
And that's something that formerly enslaved people hint at. There's an account in the book that I discussed where a formerly enslaved person is talking about how she was born of sexual assault, that her mother was sexually assaulted by her master, and that her master's wife knew that she was sexually assaulted and knew that she was, in fact, a child born of rape. And in the context of knowing that, she still coerced or compelled her mother to wet nurse her infant. So there are moments in which formerly enslaved people talk about the fact that white women are quite privy to the fact that these births are happening as a consequence of sexual assault. Sometimes sexual assaults perpetrated by their own husbands, by their own family members, male family members. So there are other instances in which formerly enslaved people talk about how their mothers served as the wet nurses for their mistresses every single time that their mistresses had children. And they talk about, scores of children, a dozen children in one instance in which the mother was also lactating lactating at the same time. The enslaved woman was lactating at the same time as her mistress and was having children at the same time her mistress was having children. And so there are accounts in which formerly enslaved people are very clear that those conceptions happened in some cases as a consequence of sexual assault.
One of the most absurd things that I did read in the book was that, often women would buy an enslaved person to take their husband's place in the Civil War.
Yeah. So during the Civil War, during the first what was basically the first draft in United States history, there were a number of ways in which individuals of means, men of means, could buy their way out of service. One avenue through which they were able to do that was to hire a substitute. So, we think about just try to wrap your head around hiring somebody to go to war for you. But in this moment in which, there were impoverished individuals throughout the South, and they were given these really huge sums of money to go to war as a substitute for white men who typically either had lots of slaves or lots of wealth and were able to pay for this. In one particular instance, there was a white woman who owned an enslaved man. She didn't want her husband to go to war, so she sold a slave and used the funds that she received from the enslaved person's sale to pay for her husband's substitute.
Wow. So, so this is a tough question to ask and, but I want to ask it. It's tough because I don't know if there's an easy answer. And also it's a tough question because, I don't know if I want to know the answer. About, what are the remnants between the relationships between white women and Black women today, in modern times?
When we look at the ways in which white Southern women failed to come to the aid of enslaved women when they sought out their help, it doesn't surprise me that there are many instances today when sisterhood fails, when the alleged sisterhood between white women and women of color in this country fail.
Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers, thank you so much for talking to me today. And thank you for all of your work and your research and, of course, your emotional investment in bringing us this really, really important piece of work.
And thank you so much, Jen, for having me.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this conversation and you want more episodes like this, the best thing that you can do to support the Electorette is to subscribe and leave a review. Pause this episode now and hit the subscribe button on iTunes or wherever you're listening. It's immensely helpful. And please tell your friends and family to subscribe. So until next time, keep up the good fight.